but we are going to keep the movement moving on here, and we're going to turn to Big Pharma. And believe it or not, they're continuing their machinations to keep the prices of drugs very high. And we are quite honored to be joined for this conversation by Andrew Perez, who's a senior editor and reporter at The Lever. Andrew, thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
Well, we're really happy to have you. And I also just want to note at the outset that along with Matthew Cunningham Cook, you are the author of Big Pharma's American Con, about the issues we're going to jump into here at levernews.com, which I hope everyone reads. But, you know, Andrew, it was a great piece, by the way, and there's so many different elements to it. I mean, it's about like why drug prices are high, how they're trying to keep them high, how it works. But just in the interest of, you know, maybe people who aren't following everything in the news, maybe give us just a sense of what this Medicare negotiating drug price is, like what that is and how exactly it works, just to give us some framing for the conversation moving forward.
Sure. Well, so Democrats have been talking for, the last 2 decades, roughly, about allowing Medicare to begin negotiating drug prices. When Congress passed the Medicare Part D program, when they created it, in 2003, they actually banned Medicare from negotiating drug prices, and instead basically allow private insurers to negotiate those drug prices instead. And, it's one major reason why drug prices in healthcare costs generally are exorbitantly high in the United States compared to other countries. And so, last year, as part of the Inflation Reduction Act, Democrats have enacted the first basically pilot program allowing Medicare to begin negotiating drug prices, which, to be clear, is something that like most other countries do. Potentially nearly all other countries do this. Most all industrialized nations other than the U.S. allow this already. And it's, they're able to force a lot lower prices overseas than we do here.
It's really amazing just to give like people an idea of how much of a difference we're talking about. You mentioned in the piece that it's like these drug prices, and you give a few examples of specific medications, but in the US cost up like something like 1,000% more than in other countries. And I'm actually speaking to you right now from Beirut, Lebanon, where, I mean, despite the fact that Lebanon has been experiencing a horrible economic collapse for the last several years, I can still go to any pharmacy and purchase the same medications that exist in the US from the same drug makers. I'm always shocked how cheap it is here. Like constantly, like whether it's antibiotics, or whether it's like a muscle relaxant, or I don't know, like an eye drop, whatever I've needed to go purchase from the pharmacy, I'm always like, it's $3, it's $4, like really cheap. And the same thing in the US would be like $20, $25, $100, depending on what medication you're talking about. But like, explain why that is the case. Why even like a third world, very poor, economically collapsing country like Lebanon has drug prices for literally the same brand name items that in the US we're paying 1,000 times % more for.
Yeah, I mean, the main primary reason is that the government has actually restricted itself from negotiating drug prices. That is the main reason. There's also, there's all these kind of patent schemes that pharmaceutical companies have going, where they can, we grant them like long-term exclusivity, and then they're able to turn that into an even longer term exclusivity by just barely tinkering around with their product. It's something that has been going on for a long time, and it is a giant issue. And compounding this is actually the U.S. Government subsidizes the research and development that goes into virtually every drug approved for sale in the U.S. So what's happening here is that we, the American taxpayer, the public, we subsidize the creation of these pharmaceutical products, and then we actually allow pharmaceutical companies and have designed the system so that they're able to charge us much higher prices here than anywhere else. And it is literally because we do not allow the government to negotiate drug prices. And the program that's starting now is really small, right? It's actually about 10 drugs per in 2026 can be negotiated. 10 very expensive drugs that are specifically have been around for anywhere between 9 to 13 years. So they're, nearing the end of their exclusivity period. The government made a very small negotiation program because the legislation was really scaled down by some Democratic lawmakers who are friendly with the pharmaceutical industry.
Hmm.
You mentioned this, just now, sort of in terms of the subsidies, Andrew, but I was hoping you could actually talk more about that, because I think one of the interesting things in the piece that you all lay out is how much money the government is spending on helping to develop different, pharmaceuticals, and also, the impact or the relationship that has to this issue of high prices. Because of course, this is what we always hear in this debate is, well, you have to have high drug prices because that's how they do the research. And without that, we'll have no drugs and we'll all die.
Yeah, yeah. Well, so the U.S. government, we spend $45 billion annually on the National Institutes of Health, which then funds new drug research. And basically, like, studies show that every single drug that's approved for sale in the U.S. is benefiting from this research in one way, in one form or another. And sometimes it's quite substantial, where the U.S. government is developing the technology that's being used to deliver these drugs. That's something we saw even with the COVID vaccines. Is the technology, the mRNA technology at the core of the Moderna and the Pfizer products, it was developed by the U.S. government.
Yeah, well, and then I'm curious, like, if you could also talk about, like, when it comes to these, like, lawsuits you mentioned in the piece, where these pharmaceutical companies are, like, suing the US government, who's, like, ruling in their favor? And you mentioned some Democrats being in the way as obstacles, I imagine Republicans as well. But, like, who do they have on their side in this massive bureaucratic structure that's constantly working in their favor, that keeps it so that these prices remain crazy high?
Yeah, yeah. Well, so judges definitely play a role here, where some have, we wrote about here how one of the drugs that is up for negotiation actually had a generic or a biosimilar approved like a decade ago, or close to a decade ago. And they were able to then prevent it from coming to market until 2029. But yeah, you're right. Republicans play a major role here. They've played a major role in keeping this system in place, where we cannot be negotiating drug prices. They're still complaining about it today with this very small ball negotiation program. And then, we also saw several corporate Democrats, Kirsten Sinema, now an independent, played a major role in sort of scaling this back. Scott Peters played a major role in that. Kurt Schrader played a big role in scaling this back. There was a small subset of House Democrats who worked together and basically hand in hand with Kirsten Sinema to scale down the program. On the other hand, like the case for this program, that advocates would make is like, okay, yes, it's small. It's also the first time that anyone in Congress can remember the pharmaceutical lobby losing a battle, right? Like they have a very, very strong track record, including even in the Part D program in its creation, having actually blocked Medicare from negotiating drug prices. So that would be the advocates, celebrating some win here, is that like, hey, we actually accomplished something. This is the first negotiation program. On the other hand, the program probably is so small that it's not going to really drastically reduce drug prices. And they also are still allowing pharmaceutical companies, when they create new drugs, when they start bringing them to market, to basically set their own launch price. That does not happen in other countries.
Wow, that's that's amazing. But I guess when you pay the money, that's what it is. And I mean, one of the other pieces that you put in here too, I mean, and I think that's always worth noting here. I mean, what do we know about how these corporations are making off in the current system? I mean, I think, in terms of profits, the people know they're making a lot of money. I assume they're doing a lot of share buybacks and the like. But, how's the living for big pharmaceutical companies in our current system?
Yeah, very good. They're one of the most profitable industries in the country, without question. And the U.S. has been allowed to be their profit center. The thing is, these companies are making money elsewhere, right? Like they wouldn't be selling their products out of some like generosity or benevolence at lower prices overseas. They just have been allowed to gouge the American public in a way that other countries simply have not tolerated.
Yeah,
And
well, I
it's
definitely
amazing
think
too.
that.
Oh,
Oh,
sorry.
sorry. Go ahead, Rania.
No,
Please.
I was just gonna say it's amazing too, because another point you make in the piece is the fact that so much public funding goes into the whole R&D, the research and development of all of these medications that then they're making the profit off of, and then they're of course claiming like, oh no, like if we lower the prices, then we can't fund the research, when like the vast majority of research is actually coming from tax dollars.
Yeah, yeah. Well, so to that point, and to what Eugene was saying earlier, they actually, there was a study last year that found that pharmaceutical companies over the last decade, did spend more on stock buybacks and dividends to reward shareholders than they spent on R&D. So yeah, we're subsidizing the R&D and in effectively subsidizing these, buybacks, dividends, and the like.
Amazing. Well, at least, some progress is some progress. So perhaps the forward motion and the point you made there about them taking one defeat is the point to rest on here. But Andrew Perez from The Lever, senior editor and reporter there, really appreciate you giving us some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for having me.